Hello everyone once again. Welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. We've had a very interesting discussion in the chat box during the input session, and there were a couple of very interesting points that have come up. Some that I would like to pick up on and perhaps have a further discussion or further explanation about. But I think the first thing that I would like to address is one of the reflective questions that I prepared for you to think about before the session. And the question which I would like to focus on first is, what is the connection between relationship and feedback? I think some of you may have been surprised when when I spent so much time talking about relationship and the importance of creating a good relationship with our students in order for the feedback to be a good feedback, a positive feedback. I think that a lot of the things that we do in the classroom depend very much on developing a good relationship with our students. And feedback is one of those occasions where that relationship is extremely important. And those of you who attended my first session on giving feedback will remember that one of the features of effective and successful feedback is that it improves, or at least does not worsen, the relationship between the sides. If the relationship between the sides is good, and this is obviously something that you don't work on in the feedback session alone, this is something that you need to start developing a lot earlier. So if the relationship between the sides of feedback is good, then it's much easier to accept the feedback that you get, and it's much easier to give feedback. And I can see Hedy nodding her head to that. So clearly, Hedy, you agree with that.
Yes, very much so. I've been there. Actually, it reminds me of a director of studies of mine who observed my lesson, and of course we had a feedback session after that. And he took all the judgment out of his feedback, the way he was communicating to me. And I remember that we went through the whole lesson, and we got to the part, the delayed feedback, actually the delayed correction part of my lesson, where I put students' language on the whiteboard, but only ones that had some mistakes or errors in that. And he suggested that I should next time try and just hide good use of language as well. And the way he, I don't know, gave this feedback, I just took everything on board, because I was not put off, you know, by his tone of voice. And I think this is one of the key, actually, is to be, you know, to be able to express our observations in a way that we take the judgment away.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, what you've been talking about, Hedy, is, again, if we go back to the features of successful good feedback, in good feedback, we talk about what went well and what action needs to be taken. So in this particular example that you've talked about, when we give feedback to students after a speaking activity, for example, it's really a good idea to not just focus on the things that they need to improve, but also to give them examples of really good language use, to give them the confidence that they're actually making progress, that they're actually producing language which is excellent. So yes, it's a good idea to do both. Now, in terms of how that feedback is given, and the fact that the word which you mentioned, Hedy, which is really, really important, judgment, to take out the judgment out of the feedback situation, that is a really important thing. As I said just a minute ago, I think working on the relationship with your students, or in the case of, for example, directors of studies, or people who are going to observe other people's lessons, that relationship needs to be worked on long before the feedback actually happens. So when we're talking about teaching, you need to start working on the relationship with your students from the very first moment when you meet them, or sometimes even before you meet them, if you have contact with your students before you meet them, it's really essential to try to build a good relationship with them, because then it's so much easier to pass on any kind of information. And students are much more susceptible to, they really want to listen to what you've got to say, and they're ready to accept whatever you say, and they're ready to accept your advice, and they're ready to accept your guidance. So yes, it is absolutely essential. Now, one of the things that came up in the discussion in the chat box during the input session was a point which I think Gabby made, that we sort of do we when we talk about the drama triangle and the three roles, the persecutor, the rescuer, and the victim, this is something that we do in sort of life outside the classroom, but do we bring that into the classroom? And if we do, does that mean that we teach with our personalities? And I think it's actually a positive thing to teach with your personality. But also, I think it's extremely important for us as teachers to be not only specialists on language, but also to be excellent communicators, and also, in a way, psychologists. And I think that, yes, we bring our personality into the classroom, but we have that choice of reflecting on our behavior. We have that choice of reflecting on our communication, on our communication style, and we have the choice of improving that communication style, improving that verbal behavior to the benefit of our students, and also to our own benefit. So I think that's a very important point.
And Anya, I think just adding to this, that what is very important in this case is awareness.
Yeah.
Awareness regarding the way we express ourselves, so our choice of words, for instance, and also the way we listen to our students, so that our words are not on autopilot, driven by our habits.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's really important. We are in the business of communication. We teach communication. And so we really have the responsibility to be very careful about how we communicate, and to reflect on how we communicate, and to keep improving our communication. So yeah, that's a very, very important and very good point. I'm just looking into the Q&A box, and there are already 3 questions there. So I would like to start with a question which actually came up again in the discussion in the chat box during the input session, and it's a question from Gabby. What if the teacher's beliefs about feedback differs from the beliefs of the students? That's an extremely interesting point, and I said to Gabby in the chat box that I would like to address this issue. This is a situation which does happen, obviously. My beliefs about feedback can be different from the beliefs of my students. So I don't think I have the right to try and push my way of doing things onto students. But what I do try to do is I explain to students, and this is something that I talked about in the input session, I do talk to my students about why I do things the way I do, and what are the principles that guide me in setting things up in the way that I set them up. And from my experience, most of the time, students understand and accept this way of doing things. But yes, I have had instances where students simply disagree with the way it's done. And I don't feel that I have the right to push them to do something that they're not going to feel comfortable with, or something that they really fiercely oppose. So I think it's essential to explain. It's essential to provide as much information as possible. It's essential to perhaps start with students who believe in the same things that I do, And so when I do things with students who believe the same things about feedback that I do, or who agree with me, and then other students can see how it works in practice, that can actually help to bring them around. So as I said, yes, I have had instances where students did not necessarily agree with me, but most of the time, you know, because I do take the time and the effort to explain to students why I do things and how I do them, most of the time they actually come around to this way of thinking, and they see the benefit of what we do and how we do it. So this is what happens when students and teachers' beliefs actually differ. Talk to students. You know, this is, I think, one of the most important things that you can do when we talk about developing a relationship with students. One of the most important things that you can do is, or you should do, is talk to your students and talk to them again and talk to them again. When you talk to students, you first of all give yourself a chance to hear about their experiences and their beliefs. And that helps you understand where they come from and why they do things the way they do. And it also gives me a chance to explain why I believe what I believe and why I think this way of doing things is beneficial for them. So yeah, talk to students and talk to them again and talk to them again. I hope that answers Gabby's question, but if there's anything else, Gabby, that you would like to add here, please do. Or if you have another question, just pop it into the Q&A box. Okay, there's another, oh, we've already got 4 questions in the Q&A. Okay, so let me have a look at the second question in the Q&A. When teaching multinational adult groups, it's crucial to word the feedback so that it is not offensive and it's effective at the same time. Some words can affect the result of the feedback depending on what is acceptable in different cultures. What are the steps of giving effective feedback or wording feedback appropriately when teaching multinational groups? Thank you very much for this question. This is a very important issue. A lot of us actually teach multinational groups and multicultural groups, and that is a very important issue. Again, obviously I cannot give you a recipe for success for every single situation, but my recipe for success is always really the same. Talk to your students. So that's number 1. And number 2, or maybe actually it's even more important than talking to them, listen to your students. It's extremely important to understand what works for your students and what doesn't. I actually find myself very often asking my students, is this okay with you? Can I do it like this? Are you going to have any objections if I do it in this way? Or if I say something like this, is it okay with you? I actually check with my students, just as I would check when talking to anybody. And it doesn't really matter whether it's a professional context or a private context or personal context. I tend to check with people whether what I say and how I say it, does that work for them? Do they understand words in the same way that I do? You know, even when we're talking about a group of people who come from the same culture, there are still misunderstandings because we all understand words in different ways. So listen to your students, observe your students, talk to them and ask them. And this is also, kind of takes me back to one of the issues that also came up in during the discussion in the chat box, is it, how do you actually measure the effectiveness of feedback? And because, you know, it's it's very important to talk about the features of effective feedback or features of good feedback. And, you know, we practice this, we conduct feedback according to these principles, and we conduct feedback according to those do's and don'ts that we talked about in the first session. But how do we actually know whether the feedback that we give is effective? Again, ask your students. And actually, many years ago, when I developed the practical do's and don'ts of giving feedback, which are based on the principles of giving effective and successful feedback, I also designed a very simple questionnaire, which is based on those practical do's and don'ts. And I actually sometimes ask my students, can you have a look at this simple questionnaire, and can you tell me, by filling in this questionnaire, can you tell me how effective my feedback is? And I also do that sometimes with my teacher trainees. So when I do lesson observations and then I give feedback to the teachers whose lessons I observed, I sometimes also ask them for feedback on my feedback. And the questionnaire is actually really simple. So if you think about those practical do's and don'ts, one of the points is how detailed the feedback is. So if we have a scale between, I don't know, for example, -5 and +5, where -5 is the feedback is very general, and +5 is feedback is very specific and gives very specific details, then I ask students or teacher trainees to put a cross on that line between -5 and +5, to put a cross which represents how they feel my feedback, or how specific they feel my feedback is. And I do this with the 6 points that we mentioned in when we talk about the do's and don'ts. And that helps me decide whether I'm actually giving feedback which is specific enough, which is timely enough, etc., etc. Hadi, I think you wanted to say something.
It's just, I love this idea. First of all, it's really courageous, because you are, in a sense, exposing yourself to the students, to your students. It shows genuine care, so the students feel that how they are as a person, they matter. They are important as well, because they have a say regarding how you talk to them, and a lot of them may not be used to this. Like I find it really interesting that based on what you are talking about, like the negative is missing. It's like you're using the language of compassion, I would say, non-violent communication. And even when, like, the tag THE feedback form comes to my mind, where there is no really place for what's wrong. And this is how we are wired, and when I get feedback, I'm just ready for all those red, lines and messages and notes and everything. And what you are saying is something very different. You still address what goes wrong, or what went wrong, or what could be improved, but your approach is different. It's not like zooming in on that and then
thank you very much for this, Hedi. I think it's actually really important to look forward rather than to look back. And I think if we're talking about things which went wrong, that's not very productive, because, okay, I made a mistake, but what now? So if we are positive about things, then we're actually looking forward, and that's what learning is all about. Learning is about looking forward and about moving forward. So that's why I really prefer this kind of approach to kind of being stuck in, you made a mistake, so what, now let me just clarify one thing. It doesn't mean I'm a saint, and it doesn't mean that I always get it right. It doesn't mean that I don't make mistakes when I give feedback. I do, but these are the principles which are always sort of at the back of my head when I talk to people and when I give feedback. And I think, and again, this is something that I mentioned in the first session as well, ever since I started quite a few years ago now, ever since I started learning about conflict management and mediation, this has actually helped me enormously to improve my own communication and to be able to reflect much more effectively on my own communication. So that's been a huge learning process. Okay, let me have a look at another question from the Q&A box. The next question is there a set of phrases to give feedback that you use and that will work in every environment? Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to answer that question. I'm sure I use certain set phrases. I can't think of any good examples now. I think I would say that a lot of what you would probably hear from me in feedback would be "I think," because it's, from my point of view, it's extremely important to say what's my perspective on things. Yeah. And again, that goes back to those practical do's and don'ts that we talked about in the first session. It's important that if I'm giving feedback to somebody, it's important that this person has a chance to discuss that feedback with me. So I'm talking about me and my opinion and my views. Yes, Hedy?
I think it's more important to be aware or become familiar with the procedure, and follow that, and just tailor it to the situation that we have.
Yeah.
Because every single person is different, and you mentioned it, Anya, and I agree with that so much, that we need to be psychologists as well.
Yeah.
So every single one of us is different, and my choice of vocabulary needs to fit that person.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
circumstances.
Yeah, I think our job is kind of even more difficult in the sense that, you know, most of the time we give feedback in the language which we are teaching, which means that we need to work, or we need to adjust two things. One is our communication style, and then we also need to grade the language. And that's actually not a very easy task. Yeah. I think, you know, again, when I think about the feedback that I tend to give, very often I start with, what do you think? Or take me through the situation as you saw it, or as you felt it, or as you experienced it. Again, you know, when I think about my work with teacher trainees, when I observe a lesson, then most of the time, the first thing that I do is I ask the teacher that I observed to take me through the lesson and to comment on how they experienced the lesson. So I try to ensure a very high level of participation from the person that I'm giving feedback to, and it's the same for students. And again, one of the things that came up in the discussion during the input session was allowing or giving the students an opportunity to give peer feedback before we actually give our own feedback. And that also, and that creates a situation in which students are much more open to listening to the feedback that we provide, because once they have listened to the feedback from their peers, which we know is more acceptable for students, then they're more open for our feedback as well. So, and again, we also kind of show them that we believe that they are responsible for their own learning and for the learning of the whole group that they're working with or in. So yeah, I think if we again, if I think back to situations in which I give feedback, I think participation is a big point for me. And yeah, you would probably hear me say I think, or in my opinion, a lot. Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's have a look at another question. Have you ever used rubric for giving feedback as an example? And have your students ever created their own rubric to provide feedback to another group's project in the class? when I'm kind of assuming that by rubric you mean feedback criteria. And if we're talking about feedback criteria, then yes, yeah, I think might be a good idea if Maria could clarify what she meant by rubric. Okay, Maria has raised her hand.
Hi, hello again.
Hi, Maria.
Hi. What I mean by rubric is just giving them 3 or 4 points of criteria to just evaluate the other members of the group, well, other groups that they are doing a presentation perhaps in class.
Yeah, that's absolutely.
Criteria. So what do they have to take into account?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you may be able to extend it for me.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Maria. Yes. And this is again one of the things that I talked about in the input session. You know, when you give feedback to students, you can actually either use criteria which have been developed commercially, for example. I mean, some course books will give you some criteria for some feedback criteria or success criteria or assessment criteria. You can actually call it different names. You can use criteria developed by examination boards, or you can develop your own criteria, or you can develop criteria together with your students. I think to a large extent it depends on what you are trying to achieve, because you could be working on 2 sort of major areas. One area is the language, development of language and language skills, and the other area would be developing feedback skills. So again, you know, if you go back to what I talked about in the input session, when I was showing those pictures of a beginner climber and an advanced or experienced climber, you start easy. You know, you ask students to look at criteria which are relatively easy to digest, so to speak. And then next time you do peer feedback, for example, then you use criteria which are more complicated. And next time you use peer feedback, you use criteria which are even more complicated. You can't just throw them in at the deep end and expect that they will be able to provide feedback to their peers using a very complex set of criteria. It just doesn't work this way. They need to be kind of led gently into this process. And again, it's a learning process for them. So yes, I do use rubrics a lot. When I work with groups, I use rubrics a lot, and I get students to develop their own rubrics or criteria as well. But generally, I tend to, again, if I get students to develop their own rubric or their own criteria, it's again not it's not a case of throwing them in at the deep end, but I help them with that, and again, that's a learning process as well. So if I've only started working with a given group of students recently, then I'm not going to ask them to develop a very complex set of criteria. We're going to again start easy and then kind of move from that. Okay. Another question also from Maria: did you negotiate the points to give feedback on in both instances, or did you allow your students to do it by themselves? Okay, again, it depends. Sometimes it's a negotiation process, and sometimes yes, it's the student's initiative. And again, it really depends on what it is that you're trying to do, and it depends on how long you've been working with the students and how much time you have spent already on developing feedback criteria with your students. So the answer is yes. Sometimes it's a negotiation. Sometimes it's a straightforward situation of students providing the feedback criteria. But because ultimately, as a teacher, I am responsible for organizing the teaching/learning process. I do reserve the right to have a look at the criteria that students have developed themselves. And then if there is something that I fundamentally disagree with, then I will talk to them about it. Okay, so yes, even though I do allow students to develop criteria by themselves, I do, as I said, I do reserve the right to have a look at them and sort of give them a final go ahead. Because as I said, as a teacher, I am responsible for organizing the process. And again, you know, going back to what we talked about in the first session, I am not responsible for students learning. The students are responsible for learning, but I am responsible for teaching, and I am responsible for organizing the whole process. So I think this is something that's quite important in terms of what my job is, basically. You know, I am in the classroom for a reason, and that reason is organizing the whole process. I think, you know, I hope I'm not the kind of teacher who kind of pushes students to do things that I believe are good for them without really looking at whether they're happy with it or not. But as I said, you know, I am aware of the fact that I am responsible for organizing the process. But yes, I talk to students about it all the time. Okay, right, this is not a question. Maria says, brilliant, thank you for your answer. Okay, that gives me feedback that I have actually answered your questions, Maria. I'm very glad about this. There were also a couple of other points that have come up in the discussion in the chat box, which I would like to perhaps spend a little bit of time talking about. One of them was, I asked a question, did you ever give feedback which was not successful, and what did you learn from that experience? This is, I think as teachers, you know, because we encourage reflection in students, I think it's also our responsibility to reflect on what we do. And, you know, as a teacher, I keep learning from what I do in the classroom, and also from things that didn't maybe go the way I planned them. And I think, you know, one of the situations in which you learn fastest if you do something that really didn't work, okay? And the big question is obviously, you know, do I take the time to think about what happened and what could I do not to repeat that terrible experience? And if I do take the time to reflect, then both my students and I can learn from that experience or can benefit from that experience. And I'm saying that students can benefit from that experience because if I strive to improve the way I do things, that is to the students' benefit, I believe. And I can see Maria saying also, I have given feedback which did not go down very well. Yeah, you know, it happens to all of us. It happens to all of us. I don't think, you know, I have yet to see a teacher who's always been absolutely perfect in everything that they do, and who has always given absolutely fantastic feedback, and who has never had any misunderstandings in the class happening in the classroom or with their students. You know, it happens. And I think it's not I wanted to say that it's not important that mistakes happen. It is important that mistakes happen, but the more important thing is, what do I do with what happened, you know? But I think it's equally important to reflect on things that went really well, because if you feel that something has gone really well, then you want to know what exactly was right, so that you can repeat that experience, so that next time you do the same thing, you can do it equally well. And sometimes it's chance, it's just a coincidence of good things happening, and that's why things happen in a positive way. But sometimes it is because you have done something that is going to work in other situations as well. So as a teacher, I want to be able to reflect on things that I did well and on things that didn't exactly go as planned, so that I know where to go next time round. There was a question there's a comment from Maria who says, I was trying to change some dynamics which, according to my way of doing things, did not contribute to learning. And Gabby asked a question, Maria, did it work? Okay. All right. I think that conversation is going on in the chat box, but there's another question. Oh, yes. Okay, go ahead, Maria.
Well, yes, because what happened is that it was in a context in where, we were talking before about, learning, not about getting grades. So, of course, I was just working, on, for me, is the principle is learning. And not, grades are important, but then in order to achieve high grades, you do have to learn on how to achieve those grades. So it was a very simple, I will always remember that. The students had to do presentations, and they were used to doing the presentations like copying from YouTube, and then just doing a presentation using some items, some videos from YouTube, and presenting it to the class. And then just defending what they were doing. And then I just wanted them to be not original, but to do something that they have created themselves. Mm-hmm. And there was an example, a very intelligent boy, very high level. His English was very, very high. And what he just presented to the class, I laughed because I thought he was very humorous. Mm-hmm. He was going to teach the class how to peel a banana. He just got the idea from YouTube. It wasn't something that he had, and he just presented the video. And I thought, well, that's very good. And of course, my criticism was that because his level of English was very, very high, and he was a very intelligent boy, well, I would have expected something a little bit more creative. And then he just said to me, oh, we've always done it this way, and no other teacher has ever criticized us. I said, that is not a criticism. It's just, I would like to encourage you to do things more creative, and that the whole class is going to enjoy. Mm-hmm. But anyway, it was, I had to laugh because I just felt a bit insulted that an 18-year-old boy would present the class, that was his presentation, to teach the students how to peel a banana. Mind you, I have to say that when I got home, I tried to peel the banana the way the chimpanzees do it, the monkeys do it, and it did work.
You see, you've learned something.
I learned something.
I think this is an excellent situation. In which, because one of the things that this student said was, we've always done it in this way, and nobody ever had any doubts about what we do, or he actually used the word criticize. I think this is one of those situations which kind of begs for a discussion beforehand. So I think, if you ask students to do something like this, and if this is the first time that you're asking them to to do a task like this. So this is a new group for you, new students for you, and you are new for them as well. They don't know you as a teacher. I think that it would be great to have a discussion beforehand on your expectations. So, you know, talk to them about what kind of presentation you expect, what sort of thing, try to brainstorm together with the students, what kind of things they could do. Talk to them about what kind of things you think are not necessarily things that you would want to see, etc., etc. So if you set the parameters before they actually do the task, it's much easier for them to meet the requirements, or to meet the expectations, or to meet the success criteria for a task. And then feedback is actually kind of easier in this situation because they know what the expectations are even before they actually started working on the task. So I think this is, as I said, one of those situations where a discussion beforehand would be probably a very good idea. I think, again, you know, when we talk about success criteria or assessment criteria or feedback criteria, it's always a good idea for the students to know what the criteria are before they actually do the task. Because, you know, when you take an exam, you know how you're going to be assessed in that exam. And I think it's only fair to the students to know how they're going to be assessed when you ask them to do a task, which is then going to be assessed. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about formal assessment, but you know, in order for them to understand the feedback and to understand the benefit of feedback that you give them, it's important for them to know what it is that you're going to look at when they're actually performing, like in this case, doing a presentation. Yeah, if there are criteria, then let them know beforehand what the criteria are. Hedy, you've switched off. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, so first of all, when Maria came through and she actually quoted that sentence that she told her student, my gosh, I could feel even her tone of voice changed. And when she paraphrased it, it was so different. I didn't like, it was not offensive at all. Yeah. And I could understand why she was saying that to me. Yeah. It's so important, even her tone of voice changes depending on what kind of voice we choose. And also, just one more thing is this is also the cases like giving feedback, getting feedback, is we cannot take anything for granted. So even when I have occasions when something goes amazingly well, it may not go well the next time. So I don't know, it's almost like being alert, just living with the situation that we find ourselves in, and just respond to that.
Yeah, but I also think that sorry if I've interrupted, Hedy, but I think it's you know, sometimes situations in the classroom surprise us. Yeah, and as you said, Hedy, you know, we need to always be on our toes and be able to respond. But I also think that we also need to be able to say, I'm sorry, I cannot respond right now. I need time to think about this. So if a student asks a question or does something that I would like to give feedback on, but I'm not ready to do it straight away, then I would say, okay, I would like to talk about this, or I would like to give you feedback on this, or I would like to answer your question, but give me a little bit of time and I will come back to you on this. And the important thing in this situation is actually coming back to that student. So if you promise that you're going to come back to the student, you need to do this. It shows respect, if not anything else. Yeah.
Respect, and an amazing example for students.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Okay not to know. It's okay not to have answers to everything.
Yeah.
You know, in this red hot minute.
Yeah.
But but still, you know, I need some thinking time, and I will get back to you. I saw a question from you about the Zero project.
Yeah, it's actually Project Zero, and yeah, you asked if this is about if it's the environmental one. I think the environmental one is called Zero Project, and the one that I was talking about the one that I mentioned on one of the slides is called Project Zero, and it's a project which is run by the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And it's something that I would really like to encourage everybody to check out. If you just Google Project Zero Harvard, then it will take you to the website of the project. This is a project which doesn't necessarily have anything directly to do with feedback, but this is an extremely useful project when we talk about teaching in general. This is a project which focuses on making thinking visible. In other words, what are the things that teachers can do in the classroom, or what are the things that teachers can encourage students to do to help them develop thinking routines? Oh, and yes, Gabby has posted the link to the project website in the chat. Thanks a lot, Gabby. Excellent project. If you go to this website, you'll see there are millions and millions of fantastic ideas, fantastic resources that you can use, and these are resources that can be used by teachers of any subject, and obviously including language teachers. And this is a project that I first came across when I was working with students preparing for the International Baccalaureate. One of the things that you do within that context is visible thinking, or developing visible thinking. And that's a very useful website for that. It's also a website which has inspired me in a lot of very, very different ways. And one of the ways in which it has inspired me was to look at something that I was talking about in the input session, and that's creating the positive feedback environment. That idea is actually based on making thinking visible by Project Zero. So highly, highly recommended. And when you check it out, you'll never want to leave that website. Full of fantastic ideas.